Welcome. I'm Anne Bowditch. I'm a therapist and I'm author of 2 books currently. First one being The Energy of Anxiety and the Power of Confidence. And I'm really lucky today because I've got the amazing Deborah Wiggins-Hay with me today. And I'm just going to, before I introduce Deborah, I'm just going to run through a few biography moments of Deborah, although there's a lot more to her than what I'm about to tell you. So Deborah Wiggins-Hay is effectively the mind-body detective. Deborah works with her clients on many different levels, from spiritual and personal development to emotional or biological health issues. She believes that for many of us, these are all one and the same thing, underpinning them all in the premise that we are all on a journey to evolve our soul by connecting to the true spirit of ourselves. She states, understanding ourselves more fully and evolving and aligning our thoughts, feelings and actions is how we come to discover the root of our happiness and joy. Now, Deborah's quite an expert on the thyroid and recovering from thyroid health issues, and she has in fact healed herself using her own treatments of hypothyroidism, and that's the topic for today. Just a few more bits of information on Deborah. She's actually trained in many therapies and techniques, and she's really adopted her own unique way of working with her clients. I've had first-hand experience of Deborah's great work, and it really is quite incredible to see the transformation that she can make. Often in, sometimes quite a short period of time, you begin to notice those layers begin to shift. Deborah is a practitioner and teacher of the mind-body detective tools and techniques of well-being. She's also a teacher of subtle energy medicine and the wisdom of our senses. And currently she is writing a book on hypothyroid free. That's the title, hypothyroid free, unless she's decided to change that at any point. And that will explain her discoveries and her experiences. So that's, as I say, in a way, it's a brief intro because there's a huge amount more to the wonderful Deborah Wiggins-Hay. But welcome, Deborah.
Hi, thank you, Anne. Gosh, I sound far more interesting than I really am.
Oh, I don't know. I think you're very
interesting. Thank you. Yeah, gosh, what shall I say? I guess, I've been on a journey really thinking about my thyroid for a long time because, I was underactive. My thyroid, I was diagnosed with Hashimoto's, and I was diagnosed when I was 25 after the birth of my first child. It took a while before I got the diagnosis. It was a good sort of 18 months or so, and the period between the birth and the diagnosis, I was sort of in and out of hospital with various issues that were going on and not really knowing what was happening. In fact, at that point, I remember, because I had a huge growth that was sort of growing very quickly on the front of my neck, I remember thinking that I may have had, something far more serious, that perhaps I had some sort of cancer. And at 25, having just had my daughter at that time, and we didn't have Google and we didn't have the internet, or back in the dark ages, it was very difficult. I remember going to the library and, trying to wade my way through medical books, trying to understand what might be going on with my little baby in my pushchair. And, it was a difficult time. But here we are now, a long way down the line, 25 years later, and it's been a journey, but it's been very interesting. So yes.
Yeah, I mean, it's what I take from you is that you've been very thorough with working out this condition and very sort of persistent in achieving what you've achieved by not needing medication anymore by getting your levels back up to what the doctors say are fine. So that must mean the normal range. And that, even for somebody who understands this work, that's actually a huge commitment to achieve that. And I think, you know, anybody in this industry would appreciate that, the recognition that you deserve for achieving that.
Well, it was a conscious decision to do the work that I wanted to do. I had spent a long period of time, you know, I guess my health journey goes from, you know, having to discover ways really early on, because although I was medicated, unfortunately I was one of those people who just, I didn't, although I was medicated and then the doctors were sort of saying, yes, your levels are fine, and there wasn't a lot of information around at that time, as I said, you know, I still had all the symptoms. I still felt absolutely awful. And so, you know, continuing to go to the doctors and being told that I was fine and that, you know, just go home and carry on, it was impossible for me to do that. And you know, I'd always been very busy. I'd been traveling as a musician. I'd had a, you know, a really busy, full, creative life before that, and suddenly, you know, I could barely function through the day. My brain, I couldn't remember anything. I was exhausted before the day even began, difficult to get out of bed. I was cold all the time. You know, I'd have to have a bath 2 or 3 times a day just to even try and keep my body temperature, you know, to bring it back up to normal. I was trying to do all of that whilst I had a new baby, you know, new house, all those sort of life things going on. So I had to find very quickly other ways to try to work out how to, you know, like manage my life and get my life sort of back together. And so the option left for me was to begin to look at, you know, alternative options and thinking about my health in a different way. And I guess, to be fair, I'd always, you know, I always thought, one of the first things I said to my doctor was, you know, well, I'm not going to be on medication all my life. When I was told I would have to take these, you know, these sort of hormone replacement tablets forever, I just remember thinking, well, that doesn't, you know, I just don't think that's, I had more belief in the power of my body to heal than I had this belief that I would be forever on this medication. So I think fundamentally, first of all, that was the first most powerful belief that I did already have within myself. And that's not to be sort of, you know, downplayed, because it's really important to believe in that. Saying that, it didn't mean that there was a recovery right at the beginning. I went through years of searching, years of educating myself, years of training in different therapies. All of them had different elements that were helpful, but it wasn't really until I got to this sort of last several years, really sort of beginning to sort of move fully into this whole sort of energy psychology approach to health and understanding that mind-body connection on a much deeper level. That's when suddenly all the pieces came together, and I was able to focus my mind and my efforts in working on that one specific issue.
So even before you effectively had the knowledge of the type of treatments that really could heal this and the mind-body connection, which I'd like you to explain a little bit more about in a moment, but even before that, there was an understanding or a belief within you that the body can heal somehow. You just didn't know how to get from A to B at that point, but you knew that it was possible, but you don't know how you know. It was almost like a gut instinct.
Yeah, it was a gut instinct. Maybe it was an intuition. I think also, you know, and this is shared by a lot of people who have thyroid issues, you know, when you go into meet the doctor, or you go into these various situations, especially with issues like thyroid or other, you know, long-term chronic illnesses where you have to have continual sort of assessments or examinations, you know, is that when you go along, you have this whole life experience. The symptoms, that the reason you go is because you're having symptoms and they're affecting your whole life. But actually what happens is the focus becomes all about the symptom. And what happens is, and I understandably why that happens in medicine, is that the specialisms sort of go down and down and down and down to the point where you'll barely recognise like what's happening in your life, who you are as a person. None of that actually has any importance once you go into that field. And what happens is you start to be just looked at in terms of it's just your thyroid, or it's just whatever the other parts are. And the other part of my story was, as well as my thyroid sort of suddenly, you know, going haywire, is that I also suddenly had gallstones. I suddenly had these other sort of symptoms, and just there was a part in my mind which was also, I think, not just intuition, it was logic. It was a logic that was saying these things cannot all be separate. They have to be connected. There has to be. And I kept asking the thyroid people, how is this linked to the gallbladder? And how is this linked to, you know, then I had, you know, my liver count came back completely you know, all over the place. And then I was like, well, how is this connected? And every one of them, they were just focused in the specific specialism that they deal with, and that's no disrespect, because I think Western medicine is absolutely amazing. The things that we can do is absolutely amazing, but for me, when I was receiving medication that wasn't working for me, when I was asking these sorts of questions that were logical but also intuitively felt right for me, I wasn't getting anywhere with answers to those questions.
I think that's it, isn't it? Is if medicine was sort of invented now, I'd like to think that somebody would walk into a doctor's office, and I suppose this is what, if we had a term holistic doctor, this is what would happen, is they go in there with their symptoms, and the first thing the doctor asks you is, okay, what's going on for you? Either what's stressing you, or what's recently stressed you, or what's changed in your life. And I just very briefly, I went through fatigue, very, you know, a type of chronic fatigue. And when I went to the doctors, I didn't really get the answers. I was just told to stop cycling, but no one said to me, what's changed in your life? And the biggest thing that had changed is I changed career from a very sedentary job to a very active job, and also the hours of work had changed dramatically. And then I was trying to fit everything in between all of that. So had somebody asked me that question, or those few questions, then the answer probably would have been completely clear. And I can see that now, but at the time, maybe I could see it at the time, but maybe I needed someone to tell me what you're doing isn't working, you need to do something else. So yeah, that's how I'd like to see. And I think that's what I'd like to put out there to people is, when something happens within your health, within your physical being, or your mental well-being, or your emotional well-being, is ask a few questions of yourself. What's changed? What's bothering me? What's upsetting me? What's stressing me? And that you probably will find the answer as to what's going on.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So just linking in with that to this mind-body detective, because it sounds super cool, and I have an insight into some of what you do, but can you just explain a bit more about that side of things, and what we're talking about here with this sort of, you know, a bit more about this link between the stresses and the strains of life and the impact on us and that side of things?
Okay. So I have to be careful here, because I can get very esoteric and go off into all sorts of like mystical sort of areas. But I'll also try to keep it, you know, on a much more sort of biological level. And as you say, you know, nothing happens in isolation. Whilst I guess we're taught and we learn over time that we look at things individually and in isolation, the reality is that nothing that's going on in our body or our mind, or the connection of, you know, if you like, the bridge between those two things, and the very powerful aspect that is totally disregarded, is the emotional component of our lives. In fact, one of the things that I often say is that a lot of illnesses that are considered mental health issues in our language today are actually fundamentally, they have a huge emotional component, but we don't tend to like to use the language emotional health. You know, mental health gives us a sort of a certain prestige or something to, and it's funny to say that, but to taking an illness seriously, because if we talk about some sort of emotional you know, dysfunction, then we still have these really antiquated ideas that that's just sort of hysteria, or, you know, all of those old ideas about you know, this is just some sort of, it's just this sort of world that hasn't quite been brought forward or accepted as part of the whole picture. But actually, the emotions are these really important bridge between mind and body. And so, you know, working with understanding what we're feeling, you know, how we feel and what we feel has a huge impact on how our body functions. You know, has a huge impact on the biological system. We know, you know, lots of science that talks about the connection with emotions and the endocrine system. We know that how we think can affect how we feel. You know, everybody knows that. You know, if you think now of one of your best times ever in your life, it's going to just raise your mood and make you feel great. If you want to sit and think about one of the worst times, and if you want to think about the things that you've lost, you know, immediately, if you focus on those sorts of thoughts and let them replay, you'll notice that your energy and your emotional state will change. All of those things will then have an impact on the body. So there is just this complete link between how we think, how we see the world affects how we think, how we feel, and how the body interprets all of that information and then has a biological response which is appropriate for it. So the thing that ties all those things together is mind, really. You know, mind is that aspect, not just brain, but the mind. It works with all levels of consciousness, whether that's the conscious mind, cognitive thinking, whether it's the unconscious, you know, all of those automated responses, whether it's the emotions, you know, those parts, we know the parts in the brain that are associated with that, and whether it's you know, how the information that we're receiving into the body and how we're processing that, and how the body then responds and directs information back out into the world. All of that is operated through that part of us, which is the mind, you know, the psyche. So, you know, I could give some sort of like, you know, the typical examples that, you know, people demonstrate for the mind-body connection is, you know, when you go into fight or flight responses. You know, if you saw a tiger, you know, walking down the street, not with a circus ringmaster, or, you know, I take that bit out. But, you know, if you just saw a tiger coming towards you, that's the sort of normal story that's told with you. You're going to go into a fight or flight response. You know, you're going to have, your body is going to suddenly have a huge surge of adrenaline. You know, you're either going to get out of that space really quickly, in which case you've survived, and, you know, your body will then go through the processes of releasing the adrenaline, what might happen with shaking, you know, that's because we've got huge amounts of adrenaline in our system. And then the body slowly also, over a period of time, will then also bring down the cortisol levels, which is a much more long sort of, it stays in the system for a bit longer. But it will bring all of those things down, and we will have to go into a state of rest and repair. If you've run for your life, you are likely going to have the biggest sleep afterwards, after your body has got rid of all those sort of initial stress hormones. But, you know, as you know, Anne, you know, the way that the world is today, you know, the world is full of tigers, and they don't just sort of turn up once for us. You know, we are faced with tigers almost continually from morning to the evening. Many people are juggling, you know, a dozen tigers that are appearing in their life in all different areas of their life, and so the body doesn't get to go into that sort of chronic fatigue. You know, doesn't get to go into that rest, and then of course what will happen then is, you know, the adrenal, you know, the kidney can't keep providing all of that adrenaline and all of that cortisol, and eventually we'll go into burnout.
So I love obviously we use that metaphor of the tiger a lot in our sort of industry, if you like, but I never thought of juggling 12 tigers. Now there's a challenge. But on that note, can you just maybe explain to people listening, what do you mean by the fact that in a day, you know, in our domestic lives, we might be facing all of these tigers? Can you just maybe give a few examples of what we're really talking about here?
Yeah, okay. So if you're a mother, for example, you know, you might have all sorts of deadlines that you're facing, or not just a mother, it could be anybody, but, you know, let's assume you've got care of children. You know, you've got one child that needs a certain sort of attention in one area. You know, we have the sorts of demands on us now are so huge, you know, in terms of how we have to, you know, make sure that our, you know, children are ready for things like school, you know, if they've done what they need to do, whether that's homework, whether it's having all the things that need to be ready for them. And the sorts of, also as a parent, you know, these sorts of pressures, because you have to perform to make sure that your children are, you know, doing what they're meant to be doing, you know, getting where they need to get to on time, and the expectations that there are around that, whether it's from, you know, educational institutes, or whether it's from other people in your society. You know, it could be from places like, you know, schools, churches, social clubs. You know, your children are involved in athletics, and the pressure is immense, as you know, as you all know. So they've got huge, you know, and the tigers. The important part of that is that there's some sort of life-threatening belief that underpins that. So that's where our beliefs are really important, and they're really powerful. You know. Because it's what we believe about having to achieve those things, and what type of impact that has on us, our life, our family. And if we somehow are seeing that as a huge threat to our position in society, or a huge threat to, you know, our metaphorical life. It doesn't have to be our real life, it just has to be how we believe our life should be. That creates these huge, the body is still based in that old way of seeing things and responding to things. So if you believe, you know, that these things are essential, you know, life important aspects, then your biology will behave as if that's exactly what they are. So all those things become tigers: getting caught in rush hour traffic, having to, you know, see your boss who's under pressure and is putting pressure on you, trying to get this project done, having to, you know, it goes on and on and on.
I always feel like it's like you say, this goes back to our ancestry, when our physical structure now is hardly changed from that time when we didn't live in these very domesticated world, you know, lives that we have now. And, you know, we did have to run from maybe wild animals, or we did have to chase something so we could have it for our dinner. And it was very simple then, though. But it feels like our body has not evolved, or the mind and the body link together have not evolved sufficiently to be able to recognize real danger. So when that crazy person with an axe comes running after you, to being sat in a traffic jam, late for an appointment, and still creating that same biological response as if you are being chased by either a tiger or a crazy person with an axe. And that's part of the problem, isn't it? It's as if life has evolved, but we've maybe not quite evolved at the rate that would help us.
No, and that's not surprising. You know, if you look at the sorts of the evolution, even just in the last 100 years, you know, I mean, not to try and go too much off topic, but, you know, there's huge things going on now. You know, how are we integrating and understanding, you know, computer technology, AI, you know, there are huge developments that are happening beyond our individual capability to learn ways to adapt and evolve in respect of those things, and to be able to, you know, because evolution is a process of testing out basically different adaptations and seeing which ones work best. Okay, so, and in a way, this is one of the reasons why we might find, you know, we might be thinking, why am I having the same things happening to me again and again? You know, this always happens to me. It's a form of evolution. It's, you know, it's soul sort of finding, okay, so there's another scenario of this same thing. If we continue to have those same sorts of events and experiences, and we don't like them, but we still continue to do the same things that we've been doing before, this is very well, obviously, you know, if you always do what you've always done, then you just still keep getting what you always got. So, you know, evolution is, we have the ability within us to make alternative choices if we open up to think about that and say, okay, enough is enough, I've got to do this differently because it doesn't work. But actually, evolution can sometimes happen far quicker than our individual ability to do that. And, you know, it's one of the things that also then, you know, it gets passed down generation to generation. And one of the other things that can happen is if we at least survived that difficulty, even if we come out of it not in great shape, the biology still says, I got through that, so that strategy worked. So it might still apply that strategy, even though there might be a different and better one.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So if we were to go back to the specifics of the thyroid, so we're sort of establishing here that there is this connection. Hopefully that's been made very clear, that what goes on in our lives is very much linked to what we believe about ourselves, about the world at large, and maybe other people, and generally about life. So, you know, some sort of beliefs we might have, for example, are I'm not good enough. That's a very common belief. You know, if you have this underpinning belief, which you may not even be consciously aware that you're thinking that, but when you start to strip the layers away, you know, and generally it involves working with a therapist or doing a good amount of self-help work, you begin to understand I'm not good enough is a common one. You know, things like people judge me, and that's going to make you maybe fear some sort of social interaction. And you know, there's just a whole plethora of beliefs that we can have. I'm not lovable, and the world's a dangerous place. So those underpin, don't they? Those are fundamental because they're right there. I tend to say to people, they're there in our subconscious mind. That's sort of where I sort of tend to come from. But they're fundamental, and they're strong, and they're deep. And you can't just consciously go, oh, that's not true. Because deep down you believe it. You have to work through the layers so that that belief spins around.
Yes.
So we know that our beliefs are fundamental. Therefore, that's a beginning of a link with the mind. We know that something triggers that health issue, which is generally linked to something that goes on in life, as you've given some examples of that. So with regards to the thyroid, what is that specific link? Why thyroid? What's going on that causes someone to have a thyroid issue?
Okay, that's really good points that you made there, and because the whole premise with the mind-body detective, the way that we work is to understand that every organ and every tissue has specific functions. So, when we go into stress based on the beliefs that we're holding, there is a specific type of thinking, a specific way that we've perceived or what we believe about what's happening to us, where the body would intelligently look for a biological solution for that particular problem. So it's not random. Things don't just happen randomly. The body is looking for the best solution within the understanding that it currently has. Okay, so what happens there is, we find that we have repeating symptoms. We might, you might be someone who has a lot of, ear infections, or you might be someone who constantly has certain issues in one part of your body, or, that particular part of your body, rather than actually being dysfunctional or broken, it's that part of the body that's taking the brunt of whatever it is that we think is going on, whatever we believe about our situation. So you're quite right. So the thyroid has some specific themes that are connected to it, and they can get quite complicated, and they can work through many levels. But actually, fundamentally, let's just talk about the most basic fundamental aspect of the thyroid, which is the theme of powerlessness. So I laugh because I think if somebody had said powerlessness to me before I understood exactly quite what that meant, I would have been like, I'm not powerless. I don't know what you're talking about. I think my reaction to that would have been, I definitely don't think I'm powerless. But certainly then, as you go through the experience of the symptoms of the disease, more and more you feel powerless in your life to change things, to be able to function properly. But actually, fundamentally, the theme is powerlessness. It's a it's a theme whereby we are stuck, where we don't have we don't believe we have the strength, the resources, the ability to be able to move ourselves beyond our current situation. In some ways, and this is a lot of the work that I've done as well, is that we find that we are effectively in a living freeze. So there are lots of levels of how powerlessness can show up, and also with the thyroid there are different there are two aspects. So there's always a stress phase and regeneration phase. So they show up with different types of symptoms in different situations. So it's not quite as straightforward as there's just one thing that happens and that's it. But so, for example, if I give you an idea, and the first one that I'm going to tell you about actually is quite it might seem quite mundane, but the reason I'm going to tell this story is because it's one of the things. So in my own work, when I was doing a lot of work around healing issues around my thyroid, I did lots of different things. It took me probably about 18 months or so to go from still having a thyroid issue to finally being out of experiencing any types of symptoms, and then basically being diagnosed as euthyroid. But for example, one of the issues that I had to work on clearing, and as you say, it's not just going, oh, well, that wasn't important, it didn't, it wasn't that big a deal, was something that happened in my childhood when I was 4 years old. Now, we know that a lot of our traumas and a lot of our issues that then emerge later on in adulthood are very often rooted and based in experiences in childhood, and the way that we've understood that and processed it and then take on beliefs in that moment. And actually, I mean, this is, my heart goes out to this little 4-year-old me, but it, as an adult, you might look at it and think it's really not a big deal. I was out in the garden. We lived in a masonette in London, in Hounslow, and basically my mum was indoors, the door was shut, and I was out playing in the garden. And it was the summer. I wanted to go indoors. I wanted to go back in. I'd had enough in the garden. And when I got to the front door that was closed, it was literally covered from top to bottom in the crane flies. And so, I went to sort of move to touch the door to go in, and suddenly I literally went into freeze. So this 4-year-old little girl went into freeze and couldn't move forward, needed desperately suddenly to get indoors. You see, what we have to understand is in that moment, there are lots of things that happen in that freeze moment. That little girl is completely separated from her mum, from her home, from her ability to get to where she needs to go. She can't move forward, terrified by this thing that's in front of her that she can't move forward or past. It was completely unexpected, never seen these types of creatures before. Don't know why they're there, has never seen them, terrified by the way they moved, that they sort of clung onto the door and all the things that they were doing. And then at the same time, this complete fear of believing I'm never going to be able to get home. I'm never going to see my mum again. I'm never, ever going to be able to get past this door. Where am I going to go? I'm feeling completely and utterly alone with no one around, no one to help, no one available. And so whilst this sort of scenario in itself is a tiny little thing that as an adult we would say that's not a big deal, it's not really a trauma, is it? Nothing really major happened in that moment, but in that moment huge things happened in my psyche. I was completely separated, I was alone. When I needed help, there was no one there. I believed completely that I was never going to be able to get past that moment. And that little 4-year-old had to find a strategy and work out how, to get past that. But without going too much into that, I just wanted to use that as an example of how the smallest little things actually then go into our biology. It had a huge emotional impact, psychological impact, and biologically my body was in freeze. So that was one of the first freeze moments that actually, daily, when I was given the condition of my thyroid, that would never have come to mind. But by doing the work that you do to uncover what's behind all of this, all of this connection, you find yourself in some of these amazing places that you're just like, gosh, I'll remember that now. But you would never consciously come up with thinking there was a connection, but there it is.
Absolutely. I mean, you talking about that just reminds me of a lot of client sessions that I have, and I've known clients sometimes say to me, oh, it can't be this, because as you look at it as an adult, you think, well, I can deal with that. But as a young child, when you might not have all the skills, all the knowledge, all the resources that you might then have as an adult, then your perception of that event is not the same as an adult's would be. So it doesn't matter how you see it as an adult. What matters is how you see it at the time, how you absorb that information and how you deal with it, and what you then believe. And that belief and those emotions and everything that you've said, it's almost as if it becomes very imprinted within you, physically as well as mentally and emotionally. And it is all part of your body's natural protective mechanism, isn't it? You know, this is the body doing its work, really. It's doing its job. It's not the body. See, the thing we tend to be led to believe when we're young about the body when it gets ill is the body's made a mistake. But this is not the body making a mistake. This is the body and the mind, as I say, doing its job, doing what it's meant to do. But the problem becomes when we haven't released the stress. So the imprint stays. Exactly. And we haven't created the healing then. And also, just to touch on the freeze, and again, that is a natural biological response, isn't it? And I see the freeze responses when the fight or flight response are not an option. I can't run. I'm not safe to run away. I really can't fight. I don't feel that I'm strong enough or able enough to fight. Therefore, I only have one option left, which is effectively, the way I see it, is almost like I'll fake that I'm not here. I'll fake, sort of not exactly faking death, but I'll fake that, you know, there's nothing here of me. And we go into that freeze. And maybe people might relate to that if they think about a time when they just, something happened or someone said something and you couldn't respond. You know, and most of us as an adult might be able to recall those types of experiences, and that's very similar to what the freeze response is, although consciousness really is supposed to sort of shut down, isn't it, in the freeze response? So you shut that down as another protective mechanism.
Yeah, well, it's a brainstem response, you know, so it's completely primal. You know, it's unconscious, and it's a protective mechanism. So
so it's brilliant. I mean, the human body and the mind, it's incredible, isn't it? But and it's fine if we can release these things like a wild animal does, if we can release these things very quickly, but we don't, and that's the problem. Or the stress in modern day life is prolonged, isn't it, with a lot of things. Say someone, for instance, who's got financial worries, and that could link with powerlessness, couldn't it? As that being the theme. It's, you know, if someone's, you know, maybe gone out without their wallet or their purse and got to the shop and been like, oh, I haven't got any money, that's just a mini trauma, and they know they've got the money, really. They might better just pop home and get some money or whatever. That's not an issue generally. But if someone's day after day thinking, how am I going to pay the rent or the mortgage, or that is prolonged stress, and lots of people be able to relate to that. And that's what causes the changes biologically with the mind and with the body, isn't it?
Yes, you know, and it's, the thyroid isn't only about the powerlessness, but it's a very, very important theme that is part of the thyroid. And, you know, as you say, that sort of like that freeze response is, well, actually, I have a whole other sort of theory on the freeze response in terms of coming at that from thyroid, and I'm not going to go into all of that because it's a slightly alternative, and I'll probably be talking for far too long. But
maybe for another time.
But yeah, so my sort of thoughts on the freeze response are not quite quite in line with some of that, but but that's just come from that whole sort of thyroid, working with the thyroid. But the other thing with thyroid is, so one of the things that I was going to say is that you will see, you know, interestingly, it's more women who have thyroid issues than men. It's about a 10-to-1 ratio. You know, although that's still quite a lot of men in the country that mean that they have thyroid issues. You know, so something like about, I guess, sort of something along the lines of about 130,000 males compared to the 1.2 million females, or something along that line. So, you know, this theme of powerlessness shows up an awful lot more in the female population than in the male population. But I think there is a sort of some statistics that are beginning to show that more men are beginning to have those sorts of responses. And we also see, you know, people who are in high pressure jobs who have thyroid issues, and also, you know, my experience is that I've seen quite a few people who've been in the emergency services, interestingly, and I think that's quite, you know, an important thing to consider. You know, these people who are putting themselves in the way of danger, they're putting their own lives at risk in many instances, you know, whether that's in fire brigade, whether it's in the police, or the, you know, in all of these different services now, even in hospitals and what have you. You know, sometimes, you know, the scenarios that some people are now being presented with, you know, can mean that their own, especially currently, look at what's going on in the world currently, you know, those people are providing, they're going into service every single day, and every single day they do that, and they put their lives at risk. They are putting their lives on the line. There's one aspect which is to do with that. And then if you then, you know, you wrap that up with some scenario, an event where they have a specific life-threatening moment that occurs, where they actually feel in that moment that they are, you know, they could survive, but they might not, you know, and that will be happening reasonably, you know, regularly for some people in those types of jobs. So I find that quite interesting. And then you will find, not just men, but you know, you often might find that men might be, my personal experience with people that I've worked with is that it's been often when it's been men that they've been in that type of scenario, whereas interestingly for women it might be that it's during pregnancy, after pregnancy, interestingly. So lots and lots of links with becoming a mother, which for me goes into those themes, you know, on a different type of level. It's interesting because it sort of shows the difference of the male-female dynamic, you know. And of course, traditionally, if you look at how our biology holds all this information from all of our forebears, then of course, traditionally, pregnancy and childbirth was quite a dangerous scenario for a lot of women, you know. You know, having children today is a different, you know, is a different scenario. But it's still fundamentally, it's a huge biological task that the body takes on, and it's sort of also one of those things that once you're sort of in that process, you're in that process. It's like, you know, so you have that, you're sort of in the process, you're going along for the ride. So some of this powerlessness is about, you know, when we feel like we can do something about a situation, or when we feel we can't do something about a situation. And for some people that might be in their everyday lives, it might be in the relationships they're having, you know, their personal relationships. It could be in showing up, you know, not just work, it might be in the home, these sorts of relationships. And it doesn't necessarily mean that there might be some sort of violence or anything like that, you know, which obviously would be a form of, would provide a form of sort of powerlessness for the victim. But it can also just be, you know, not feeling like you are able or allowed to express yourself, or do the things that you want to, you know, the things that you want to do to move in the direction that your life, that you want to move your life in. So there are lots of ways that this theme can show up. But the important thing is to recognise that when it does show up, that there's a profound link between all of those areas, and it is personal and it is individual, and it will relate to specific events in the past that we, you know, that we do have the ability to unfold, to unravel, to go into all of those relationships. And if we decide to do that work, then how our biology is behaving can change. Now, traditionally, we're told, you know, thyroid conditions, they're lifelong, they're progressive, they're chronic, you know, you're going to be on medication all your life, and to expect certain outcomes, and they're not going to be often a remission. However, we do see lots of people now having remissions. There are lots of things that can help with thyroid issues, from diet to environmental toxins, taking a lots of, there are a lot of people now doing a lot of work in that area. But really what I do is work on this completely sort of it's about self-empowerment and understanding ourselves, and, you know, being able to change, like you said, how we're holding on to that old information that actually may have been important when we were 4 years old, and may have been important when we had an experience, you know, 2 or 3 different other types of experiences as we were growing up. But actually, you know, we can come to that and look at it from a new perspective. And when we understand all those things, then we have choices about how we want to change that. So, you know, that's the area that I work in. So that it's about, and it's not a fast journey with thyroid, because it's very often, there are so many levels of it. As I say, it took me about 18 months, and I did a lot of work on myself. But do I regret spending 18 months of my life doing that amount of work? No. Was it fascinating? Yes. Did I learn more about myself? Yes. You know, do I understand, by doing that, do I learn and understand more about other people around me? Yes. You know, it's amazing. I find it's fascinating. And if you can't, you know, I would defy anyone to not be fascinated by their own journey, by going down, you know, we might say going down the tunnel of exploration in this sort of area, because it is a bit of a tunnel, as you know, Anne, you know, but it's fascinating. And you know, and I don't have those symptoms now, you know. Yeah, I haven't had medication now for 6 years, coming into my 7th year, and that was after basically being on medication for 20 years, albeit medication that didn't tend to work well for me because I still had the symptoms. Now I don't take the medication and I don't have the symptoms.
So, I mean, that's pretty testament to the work that it's worth doing and to what can be achieved. And yeah, I totally agree with what you say about when you start exploring what's happened, what's your personal journey been, it's fascinating. And I find it also helps you understand life so much more. And as you say, you can then often understand other people's behaviors more. And
yeah,
and all of this means that as you go through life, maybe the things that might have stressed you in the past won't stress you, because you have a greater awareness of yourself and your life. It doesn't mean that you won't ever get stressed or emotional or any of those things. You will. We're humans at the end of the day. We have those to be pushed, and we have our own values, things that are really important to us, and we still have a belief system, but we can make things much better for ourselves. So even when we get stressed, we can say, well, what was that about? You know, what bothered me about that? Why did it bother me? Or why is that pattern still occurring in my life? Why is that still happening? And that, you know, for me, I know I have one fundamental belief that still appears. And while that is appearing, I just know it's my belief to clear. So I sort of go, oh, that old chestnut's turned up again. Clear. It's like it's still there because I haven't done sufficient work on it, and I know I haven't really, but I'm aware of it. And that in itself is really helpful, because that in itself takes some of that emotional trigger away. So the intensity of the emotion isn't so strong. But you know, it's a big thing to have basically healed yourself of a condition. So
I'll just jump in there and say, I think, you know, to just say, to be I would be careful. I believe our body does heal, it self-heals, and I'm very comfortable with using that word. But, you know, I think that the sort of, that the acceptable way is probably to say in remission. You know, whether it means the same thing or how you want to interpret that, you know, it's an individual thing. You know, I believe the body heals itself. It does it, you know, no one questions the fact. You know, unless there is some biological underlying reason why it doesn't happen. For the majority of people, if they cut themselves, okay, the body within a few days, you know, it stops the blood flow very quickly, as I say, as long as we don't have any other underlying issues, you know, and the tissues begin to form, and the body heals itself, and no one questions that. We don't think that's odd. You know, how did that happen? It's just normal, you know. Well, that happens on every level of our body. It happens every single day. The body is repairing tissues, repairing, you know, functions, but it's also adjusting to active issues that it's perceiving that are happening in the moment. So the body is always balancing between repair and rest and an active or reactive state to whatever's going on in our life. And it will have to, which will obviously happens through you know, different parts of the brain, it has to balance those decisions of what is most important in every given moment. And it does that every second, every minute, every day, for the moment, from the moment we're born to the moment that we take our last breath. You know, so the process is constant. So the body is always adjusting what it needs to spend most energy on and what it needs to be doing. And that will depend on what level of stress we are experiencing in any given moment, or if we are allowing, you know, our body can only do the repair work if we are not in those heightened stress states. So yeah, I'm very happy with saying that's when rest and repair, that's when the body heals, okay? But in terms of medical, what's okay is, you know, I think the word remission gives us the ability to say, currently my body's in rest and repair and everything is balanced and working okay. But also, I guess what remission does is it keeps open this possibility that, oh, this is a thing. It's a possibility, because remission doesn't say it's gone. It just means it's rebalanced at this particular point in time, which is interesting. And I guess it fits in a little bit with what you were saying as well about, you know, how we're still humans. We can still be triggered in any moment. I still have things that happen in my life now that are very, very relevant to the thyroid thing. But what happens now is I go, oh, a bit like you, that old chestnut, I know this one. Am I going to let myself get drawn into that type of relationship again? Because I know where that's going to lead, okay? And if I go down that route, which actually a lot of my body systems are predetermined to want to do, in terms of, you know, I might want to help, you know, by doing X, Y, and Z and getting involved in those things. But I know now, because I can recognise the sorts of things that have triggered me in the past that turn on those responses. Now, whilst I've done a lot of work, and in a way, what we have to say is when we do a lot of work, it's like we're emptying. We've got this huge bucket of stuff that we're carrying around in our body. You know, all these different moments when I've seen crane flies or whatever those examples of, you know, past experiences are, and we're carrying that around, this huge bucket. When we do the work of clearing and, you know, readdressing how we're holding those things in our biology, we're emptying that bucket out. We're tipping out what actually, you know, all those things that mixed together equal, you know, a thyroid problem or whatever the thyroid problem is. You know, we're tipping that bucket out when we do that work. So the resilience of the body, or the body's ability to be able to cope with those sorts of stresses, improves because it hasn't got all that, you know, crap already and then extra added in. Okay, so it gives us extra resilience when we've done that type of work. So if we do go into a scenario, we might be able to cope with it better. But the powerful thing about what we do is when we actually begin to know ourselves to the degree that we know if we take on that decision and we go down that route, we're going to create the stress. And actually, before you do that, before you add into that bucket of stuff, you can actually go, I know that one. I'm choosing not to do that. So what happens is it doesn't clear, we don't not have the problems anymore. We just have more awareness, more, we can choose to be more mindful, we can choose to recognize and make other choices. And if we do that, that's the empowering bit. That's the bit where suddenly, you know, life is, when we say we have choices, you only have choices when you know what the choices are. Okay, when you don't realize that, when you don't know what your triggers are, when you don't know what the things are that are causing the issue, you don't have choice, because you don't know that that's even a choice you can make. So, you know, knowledge, understanding yourself, being able to begin to gain that mindfulness, that perspective, is what gives us the possibility to make other sorts of choices. And I think that's the unique thing about what we do.
And I think you can also, obviously, as you go through these processes, you begin to learn techniques as well.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, you can either learn to clear some issues as they arise, or maybe just have techniques that help you deal with them at the time. And that's obviously what we do in our work.
That's so powerful.
Yeah. So just briefly, is it fair to say that you're either in stress or you're in recovery?
In terms of your biology and the tissues and the functions of the body, yes. But it's more complex than that, because, you know, that applies not just to us as an overall system, okay? Because the biology of the whole system has loads of things going on. You know, it's not just my thyroid. This is coming back to what we said at the beginning. It's not just that individual part. You know, the whole biology is balancing this universe of information, past, future, possibility, you know, experience of emotion, of thought, it's just fascinating. You know, it's doing all those things, and it's doing it all the time. So we can, as an overall system, we may feel that we are in stress or not in stress, and we can learn to begin to notice that. But sometimes parts of the body can be in stress, or we might not feel stressed. Okay, so the body being in stress or regeneration, or part of the body being in stress or regeneration, is not necessarily the same as feeling stressed or not feeling stressed, and they are different. But overall, every biological function in the body is overseen by my TCM here, a yin or yang function. You know, it's either in stress activity mode or it's in regeneration and repair mode. We're either, you know, this is why, you know, we live in a world of yin and yang, of night and day, of, you know, fast and slow, of, you know, we live in a world of duality, and our body is built to respond to that. And what we should be doing is following, you know, nature's cycles and going in and out of those phases in a natural way. So yeah, does that answer?
And I think linking in with that is that because sometimes we can't do the natural thing of flowing with nature's cycles, is therefore there are times when we actually just have to take some action for ourselves and do some well-being activities, whatever that may be, whether it's sort of some meditation or some Tai Chi, or whether it's yoga or going for a nice walk in nature. We sometimes have to do those things for ourselves so that we can create that recovery process, that rest and repair process for ourselves as well.
Yes, definitely. Yeah.
So just a question really to finish with, I think, which is, you know, hopefully people have been enlightened and educated, if you like, by this, and also feel a bit more empowered for their own well-being. But if somebody has a health issue, whether it's thyroid or something else, what would you say maybe is sort of the first step or the first couple of steps for them to do in order to just begin their recovery process, whether it's, you know, in terms of understanding or whatever? What should they either ask themselves, or what should they do? What would you advise someone to do?
Well, you gave a really good example earlier on, where you sort of mentioned how something had changed, how your work had changed, so that you know, alongside your health change, something else quite significant in your life had changed. A lot of people recognize these connections, you know, that there is a trigger. Now, they don't think of it in these terms, but they like, oh, such and such happened, and then straight after that since then I've been really ill, you know. So, you know, my for example, my granddad, who developed cancer after the death of it was his first grandchild, and she was murdered, and he developed a blood cancer, which is, you know, in terms of like the connection, you know, it's a deep self-devaluation. You know, it's a complete not good enough, not strong enough. And I think this is only my interpretation, because obviously I wasn't doing that. I was very young at the time. He died when I was, you know, a lot younger, probably in my teens. But, you know, he visited her grave every day, and his cancer developed pretty much straight after that event. I think, you know, for whatever was going on for him, that identifies that, you know, he had a deep reaction to that event happening. You know, we know from Dr. Hammer's work, you know, that was all based initially coming from his own experience of cancer at the loss of his own son. So we know there's lots of connections with cancer as being a biological response to such a loss. But at the level of where it was for my granddad in terms of his blood as well, that's you know, going particularly deep. So it's not just that it's cancer. We have to look at what the cancer is and where it is, and what's going on in those parts of the body. But you know, so I always feel that he fundamentally felt some, I don't know, maybe some sort of deep responsibility of not being able to, you know, have done something that he obviously on a deep level felt that he should have been able to do, that he wasn't either good enough or strong enough to have done that, and that he couldn't ever resolve that issue. And every day he visited her grave, every day, it was clearly something that was part of his daily experience for the rest of his life. So I'd lost the question there for a moment, sorry. Just went a completely different direction. But yes, so what can we do? We can recognise, we can ask ourselves the question, what was happening, you know, around that time, just before that time, around that time. And if you do recognise something, then great. Sometimes those things are they're big, they're obvious, like you say, your job change, you know, maybe the death of somebody that we love, someone important in our life. There are big things that can happen that we can identify, you know, quite easily. But sometimes they're not big, and sometimes they're not obvious. I would never have thought that my pregnancy, or you know, the things that were connected with all of that, I would have never have thought of that as being a trauma as such, and I would never have maybe associated what was going on at the time with what was going on with my thyroid. So some things are easier to discern, some things aren't. If you you know, if you really want to go down this route, then, you know, there are people now, you know, there's a lot of people who work in this area and will help you do that. Obviously I'm one of them, and there are a lot of other people as well who work within the world of Meta who also can do that, of which I believe, and you've been trained in Meta as well, Anne. So you know, you have you know, a really good understanding of those connections too. So sometimes it's just signposting and having someone to help do that. In terms of thyroid, there's loads of information out there. You know, you can buy a book. You can, there are some courses that you can join. There's lots of people doing things in terms of nutrition. You know, there's or if you've got autoimmune thyroid, we haven't even talked about all the different types of thyroid issues, but if you've got autoimmune thyroiditis, then, you know, look at the autoimmune, you know, paleo diets. If you're, there's so many things, you know, there's nutritional advice. It's worth looking at what you're fully having a good understanding of all your thyroid levels is really important, because when our levels are measured by doctors in this country, not all of the thyroid hormones are measured. Not all of you're not necessarily automatically checked for your immune modulators. You're not, you know, they don't look at whether or not there's an immune aspect involved. Not necessarily. I'm not saying they don't do it. Some people get that, some people don't. So, but there are places you can go and you can get your own panels of blood tested. So that's a possibility. Now, a lot of people with thyroid issues get really obsessed with the blood, and that is not something that I do, although there is an important aspect in terms of the mind-body connection and what the blood results can be showing us. So they can be helpful, and I will work with people who've got blood results to look at what those issues might be behind the blood results that they're getting. But I really also try to avoid getting too bogged down into the blood work, because it's an area, you know, the blood tests are a snapshot of what's going on in a particular moment. And for most people, when they have their thyroid bloods done, it's done so irregular. Well, it's not done irregularly, but it's done regularly, you know, maybe once a year. Or if they're trying to work out what's going on, you might get a blood test once every 6 months. This is in the UK with the NHS. You know, it's obviously different in America, where you pay for what you want to be done. But, you know, those blood tests are a snapshot of a moment, and what a lot of people think in their head is, oh, that's what my levels are. You know, well, our levels are changing all the time, from the morning to the evening at different times of the year. So you know, I like to work with the symptoms that people are experiencing, and, you know, and we're looking at what the underlying issues are that are going on. So, you know, thyroid can be quite complex. It's an endocrine organ, so, you know, there can be lots of hormones and different things going on involved in that. But there are, you know, various areas that you can look at. One of the things that I do, and later on in the year, if it's okay for me to mention it, I'll be running my Butterfly Wings program. And that is really for people who've got, you know, thyroid issues, who want to be working in this type of way to address what the traumas and the stresses are and the mind-body connections behind their disease. And what I've done is spent a long time trying to find ways of creating a program that's affordable, you know, because to do what I've done and to train in all the things that I've trained in and to spend all of those years doing that, it's been a lot of time and a lot of money and resources. So, you know, it's difficult for everybody to be able to do that. So, you know, I wanted to try to find a way that I could share that with people in a way that was going to really help them to focus on their thyroid, come to understand it better. So the program is all about teaching them so that they learn about the sort of meta perspective of health, so that they begin to understand what that mind-body connection is. And we do that in the Butterfly Wings through something that I call the Power Hour. So we have a Power Hour every couple of weeks. And that really is about empowering, and empowering through understanding, empowering through, you know, getting to understand what it is that's going on for you behind your symptoms, and understanding what all the different things would be, you know, on all the different levels of the thyroid. And then the other aspect is what I call the Energy Hour, and that is every couple of weeks we do the one, and then we do the other, which is the Energy Hour, which is working with, as you said, you know, learning the tools that one will help to change, you know, those sorts of deep embedded connections, those sorts of beliefs, and how we change that. And also, like you say, having those as tools that, when, you know, once we know that and we've learned those things, we can use them at any moment. So when we face those moments of stress, those trigger moments, we can go into, you know, into a tool that's going to help us right there and then. So so those two things run together, and then there are different levels of the program. So you can just do those and then be working yourself, whether that's with another therapist or with other people, or just on your own level at your own pace, or you can be, you know, on another level where you also then get to work with me one-to-one, and we will work through one-to-one coaching along with the Energy Hour and the Power Hour. So those are that will be starting later in the year. So if it's okay, what I'll do is I'll give you some details later, Anne, and anyone who's interested can sort of register or what have you.
Brilliant. Okay, so I love the sound of Power Hour and Energy Hour. I feel like I'm after that myself. No, definitely. So, I mean, I think that's been a very amazing, really, hour or so of information flow. So, how can people get in touch with you? Is there a website that you'd like to sort of maybe direct people to?
Yeah, my website is www.themindbodydetective.com, what it says on the tin. And if you go there, I am undertaking some website development this year, but if you go there, you know, and leave a message, you know, which you can do from even just from the home page, you know, there are some bits of information on there as well, so you know, welcome to go on and have a browse. And later, not all of them open yet, but there will be, like, you know, some various courses that will be available. They're not all available on there at the moment, and as I say, I'm doing some updates. But if you want to make contact with me, if you do it through the website, I will receive that
Brilliant.
contact.
Brilliant. Okay, well, I think that we can bring that to a close. So thank you for your wonderful wisdom. I don't call you the wise one for nothing.
Oh, Anne, I've enjoyed myself. I love spending time with you.
Well, yes, you connect well. Yeah, I mean, you know, I joke, but I have called you the wise one for many a year now, haven't I?
Yeah, I don't know why.
You're wiser than you realise you are. But in all honesty, anybody who works with you would gain a lot. I know that just from my personal experience of any time that I've spent with you. It's always a pleasure, and it's always an education as well.
Oh,
so on that note, if anyone has heard any funny noises from my end, it's probably been my cats. We're in lockdown here in Guernsey, and they're loving me being home all the time, but they think I'm just here for them. So if anybody else takes up my time, then they get quite upset about it. So if there's been any peculiar noises, it's them. So
thank you for a stroke from me.
Well, thank you for your time, and no doubt we will speak again at some point.
Oh,
Thank you, Anne.